I decided to help Comrade Jeff with his investigation into the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines flight MH370, which vanished while on a flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing on March 7, 2014. Comrade Jeff believes that the aircraft was hijacked to Kazakhstan under direct orders from Putin and flown to Yubilyani airfield at Baikonur. It will be a challenge because Comrade Jeff's theory is fuzzy and full of holes. Indeed, some claim that it is nothing more than a conspiracy theory. But let's see how far we can get. For the record, one reason I am willing to help out is that at one time I too considered Kazakhstan to be a possible destination. Here's a note that I wrote at the time. In favor of Kazakhstan, last heading a plane was roughly in that direction. A flight path could avoid most radars, perhaps. Unrestful area of the world. More interesting. Against Kazakhstan. Why go there if all you want to do is run out of gas? Now, I'm not sure of the date when I penned that statement, but must have been around day 8 when the satellite data were officially released. Further, I am not the only one besides Comrade Jeff to have considered routes to the north. Here's what a distinguished independent group member wrote on April 8, 2014. Given the amount of time, effort, and money being spent on scouring the Indian Ocean, it would seem to be a sensible step to go and take a look in the Beshtash Valley of Kyrgyzstan. Oh, stop it. Now, Comrade Jeff developed this theory in the first week after MH370 had disappeared. He wrote a series of articles for Slate magazine with titles such as What You See Here, How to Disappear a Jetliner, Could the Missing Malaysian Airline Plane Have Been Stolen? If the missing plane isn't in the Indian Ocean, where could it be now? Note that by day 7, which is Friday, March 14th, Comrade Jeff had caught on to the idea that, contrary to the prevailing opinion at the time, the plane had instead gone north, and this in spite of the fact that the satellite data with the north and south corridors had not yet been released, and was being circulated only as rumor and hearsay. On day 8, however, with the release of both the military primary radar and the satellite data by Najib Razak, his suspicions were essentially confirmed. Why I think it is very possible that the missing airliner is in Central Asia. At this point, Comrade Jeff postulates the existence of a sophisticated actor. For me, what has become a bedrock assumption about this case is that whoever carried it out is extremely intelligent, daring, dedicated, and brave. Jeff would later describe this person as being one of extraordinary skill and sophistication, and one who is super sophisticated and nefarious, clever, and aggressive. But was this actor actually on the plane? Jeff would later state, Brodsky wouldn't be the one who figured out the hack or built the necessary hardware, just a muscle plugging it in. At this point in time, nobody knew about BFOs or why it was so important that they be spoofed, nor was anyone yet aware about the hatch to the main equipment center in the first-class cabin, nor was anyone aware of the reboot of the Satcom or the timing coincidence between the reboot and the last radar detection. Comrade Jeff was not aware of the Russian in first class or that the 2 Ukrainians of Russian descent in coach were sitting underneath the Satcom, nor was he aware of attempts to model the flight path using methods later perfected by the DSTG, the Defense Science and Technology Group in Australia. Comrade Jeff just knew that the plane had gone north. And since March 15, 2014, from what I can tell, his view has not varied one scintilla. Now, before going on, I should cite my sources of information. One in particular needs to be called out, the Continental Airlines 777 Training Manual. It is a delightful read of over 6,000 pages. It gives a description of every system on board a 777, focusing particularly on a brief statement of how it functions, the sources of power and location of circuit breakers, and all the interconnections with other systems, including a list of buses and a list of inputs and outputs on each bus. At one time, a version of this document was floating around the interwebs. I got my full copy from Mike Exner. An important caveat is that this manual is specific to 777s operated by Continental Airlines, and Malaysia Airlines 777s included some equipment not present here. As a refresher, here are 2 charts that were released early on in the investigation. When all we had were the BTOs, the last arc defined 2 swaths of the Earth's surface where the plane could have gone, called the north and south corridors, respectively, as shown on the left. Once the BFOs had been deciphered, Inmarsat released the figure on the right, showing the pattern of BFOs that would have been produced by a typical northern and southern route, with the actual measured BFOs matching the southern route. Let us start with the first item, modeling the satellite BTO and BFO data. The DSTG book probably presented the most complete analysis. Without delving into detail, for one exercise it determined the best set of routes using BTO data alone, and thus ignoring the BFO data. For this case, routes both north and south were possible, What the DSTG found was that while acceptable routes north could be generated, routes south were still more probable by a factor of 8 to 1. In either case, the acceptable routes were ones that were close to LNAV, lateral navigation, i.e. geodesics on a spherical Earth, or a constant true track, constant true bearing. Here's a comparison in more detail of northern versus southern routes. While Comrade Jeff describes these routes as being mirrors of one another, that is not strictly true. During the time that MH370 was in the air, the satellite 3-F1 was moving, at first a bit to the north, but for most of the flight to the south. This caused the ping rings to not be concentric, meaning that flights north needed to satisfy different timing constraints from flights going south. What I did here was to start with the plane initially flying along airway N571, which is where it was last tracked by military radar, and then at some point making a turn either north or south. I allowed the time of the turn, the initial bearing, and the speed to float free so as to best match the BTO data. In both cases, I kept the Mach number fixed and allowed the plane to follow a great circle route, both typical modes for commercial airliners. In this case, the route south was a better fit to the BTO data than the route to the north, 23 microseconds RMS BTO error versus 34. Now, this is just one possible route, and the plane could have flown a more complex path, but routes going north tended to require more complexity than those going south. I note here that the route north passed about 128 nautical miles west of Almaty. I artificially extended it to Yubileyny, and it required another hour of flying time, by which time it would have long exhausted its fuel. A more direct route is possible and would get it closer, but it too would exhaust its fuel well short of its goal and would require a route more complex than a simple LNAV route. If the destination had been Almaty itself, a constant true track route would have worked and would have had adequate fuel. By the way, Victor Ianello found very similar results back in 2015. A key component of modeling such routes is weather data, particularly temperature, wind speed, and wind direction along the route. On a video that aired on March 21, 2014, Comrade Jeff posited that we really don't know what the winds were that this plane was flying through. In fact, the opposite is true. Modern GPS-based navigation systems on aircraft routinely collect temperature and wind data along their flight paths, and these data are ingested by the National Center for Environmental Prediction into its global weather models, the most relevant of which is GDAS, or the Global Data Assimilation System. An example illustrating the accuracy of these models is provided by flight MH21 to Amsterdam that same night, which flew a route alongside but west of the putative MH370 North route. This was used as a validation flight by the DSTG, and they published the heading, altitude, and Mach data as a function of time as taken from ACAR's position reports during the flight. Attempts at modeling the route showed that it followed airway P628 from the Strait of Malacca all the way to Pakistan. Given the altitude, Mach, and airway route, plus the GDAS model wind data, it is possible to predict the heading as a function of time with only one free parameter, the starting position along the airway at the initial time. This is determined by trial and error to best match a few terms at the start of the flight. The two figures on the far right show the measured heading from the DSTG, shown as the points in red, along with the heading predicted by my model of the flight path as a jagged black curve. For the top figure, I omitted any wind data, and you can see that while there is rough agreement, the model fails to match the data in detail, and certain terms are predicted to happen earlier than actually occurred. On the bottom, I include wind data, and the agreement is much better. MH21 was encountering strong headwinds, up to 60 knots, causing progress to be slowed, and strong crosswinds, forcing it to turn into the wind in order to stay aligned with the airway. Because of the headwind, the flight traveled an equivalent of an extra 283 nautical miles out of a total actual distance traveled of 3,700 nautical miles. Yubileyny was 478 nautical miles to the northeast of the flight path. The logon event at 1825 was originally problematic. It exhibited a large value for the BFO, inconsistent with earlier and later values. Inmarsat originally hypothesized that it might be the result of a turn, but we now think it was due to a phenomenon called thermal overshoot that occurs whenever the Satcom powers on after having been off for an extended period of time. The effect is well known in the industry, and one can find it documented in various technical papers. The frequency reference for the Satcom is a crystal oscillator that is kept in a temperature-controlled oven called an OCXO. When the Satcom is powered on, the oven heats up to its operating temperature and signals that it is ready. However, the temperature tends to overshoot a bit, and it takes about 2.5 minutes for it to stabilize. This shows up as an overshoot of the BFOs by about 130 Hz. The figure on the right shows the BFOs for just such an event. The aircraft 9M-MRO had been used for flight MH371 from Beijing to Kuala Lumpur during the day on March 7th. The plane arrived at about 3:30 p.m. local time, and at 4 p.m. it was powered off, an event that is described in the Safety Information Report as being normal. The plane sat in the baking sun at Kuala Lumpur International Airport for almost 5 hours. It was powered back on at 8:50 p.m., which is 12:50 UT, in preparation for flight MH370 back to Beijing. Both the Satcom and the in-flight entertainment system had power restored at that time, and the figure on the right shows the BFOs for the first 4 minutes. You can see that by the time the in-flight entertainment system logged on, the BFO had stabilized. The last data packets from the IFE contained an enigmatic phrase, "Pet Shop Boys." By the way, I believe the person who first decoded this phrase was Richard Godfrey. The signal log for this event and for another log on from the previous flight, MH371, are shown below. The latter event was caused by the Satcom switching between the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean satellites, and otherwise everything was fully powered and operating normally. For some reason, the Satcom sent out 2 logon requests, then the ground sent the logon confirm message. The reason for the extra logon request is not known. Don Thompson has speculated that might have been the IFE signaling that it was ready. In any case, the IFE logged on as well, and the Pet Shop Boys phrase came 1.3 minutes after the initial logon request. For the power on event at 12:50 UT, only a single logon request message was sent, and it took the IFE 3.8 minutes to finally complete its logon. Part of the extra time was the result of the Satcom using the low-gain antenna, reducing the bandwidth of packets from the ground. However, the IFE would have powered on at the same time as the Satcom, and it may have needed additional time for it to warm up and run through its initialization checks before being ready. On this slide, the BFOs from the 1825 logon event are shown, overplotted on BFOs from the 1250 event. They basically show the same trend as before. The last set of BFOs at 1828 was actually a group of 8 packets spaced closely in time. The inset figure shows them at higher time resolution. The Pet Shop Boys message appeared again. As you can see, the BFOs had stabilized in value instead of following the decay line trend, indicating that these values should be valid. The total time for the IFE logon was 2.7 minutes, faster than the 1250 power on event, but the 1825 event utilized the high gain antenna, allowing for a higher bandwidth signal from the ground that would account for the shorter delay. In any case, the time to complete the IFE logon was twice as long as the more common 1.3 minutes as seen in the MH371 signal log, indicating that the IFE may once again have been powered on in parallel with the Satcom at 1825. Oh, by the way, the IFE was powered in part by the left AC bus. Comrade Jeff posits that the Satcom was hacked during the time that it was inoperative between 1707 and 1825, when it logged back onto the satellite network, such that once power was restored, the BFOs would seem to be as if they came from a south flight, even though the plane was heading north. 2 mechanisms have been positive, either hacking the inertial reference system data going to the Satcom or modifying the satellite inclination in the Satcom system table. On paper, either mechanism should work. The table on the left shows the list of parameters being sent from the IRS, Inertial Reference System, to the Satcom. Most of these data were used by the beam steering unit to point the high-gain antenna at the satellite and can't be altered. However, the track angle and ground speed are only used by the Doppler compensation mechanism. Some experimentation shows that only the track angle needs to be altered, and that by just small amounts, up to 6 degrees. One needs a computer model to calculate the exact amount as a function of time, and it requires access to the unaltered data. Thus, one needs to shunt the ARINC 429 cable, which runs from the Ames cabinet to the Satcom, through the computer and then back out to the Satcom. Now, there are actually 2 such cables, and they are buried in larger cables that carry many additional signals to the Satcom, so the only feasible way to access these data would be at the connector for the IRS bus where it exits the Ames cabinet. One might be able to also access a connector at the Satcom end in the overhead area of the passenger cabin. Next, we show how to alter the system table. There are actually 3 numbers that can be altered: the inclination, longitude, and the right ascension. The figure on the right shows the predictions for our LNAV route north. If one allows the 3 numbers to have arbitrary values, one can find a solution that does a decent job of reproducing the BFO values. However, the numbers are actually all quantized. The inclination, for example, is rounded to the nearest 5/8 of a degree. and while we want the inclination to be 3.3 degrees, the nearest value is 3.125. That quantization causes the best fit to become materially worse, and the RMS error increases to 5.2 Hz. Since the intrinsic error of the BFOs is 2.8 Hz, this result is only marginally acceptable, and once again is worse than an equivalent fit for a southern route. The presumption is that the hack was in place when power was restored at 1825. However, that presents a conundrum. The BFO values at 1828 ought to be valid. If the Satcom were operating normally, these BFO values would be consistent with MH370 continuing on a west-northwest course, as was seen at the last radar contact. However, if the Satcom were hacked and the BFOs are being spoofed, it would mean the plane was actually heading west-southwest. This is contrary to Comrade Jeff's theory that the plane turned further north because it was already heading in that direction, and it would exacerbate a problem in that the distance from the point of last primary military radar contact to the first arc, which is already too short for the speed of the plane, would be even shorter. There is one more set of data that needs to be discussed, and that is the ADS-B data when the plane passed waypoint Agari. Agari is a flyby waypoint, meaning that MH370 would cut the corner as it flew by, changing its bearing from 25 to 58 degrees on its way towards waypoint Bithad. The exact point where it passes Agari is the point where Agari is exactly a beam of the aircraft, i.e. bearing exactly 90 degrees to the direction of travel. On the left is Victor Ianello's rendition of the flyby, indicating that the last ADS-B point was just as MH370 was passing Agari. On the right, I've expanded that view and show the latitude, longitude, and timestamps of the last 8 broadcasts. Before reaching Agari, the ADS-B broadcasts included the correct coordinates and altitude, the latter being FL350. The 6th broadcast occurred at 17:20, 33.61. 80 milliseconds later, Agari was a beam of MH370. 460 milliseconds after that, the next ADS-B broadcast was sent. This one had the correct coordinates, but the altitude was 0. The next and last broadcast was sent 390 milliseconds after that, again with the correct coordinates, but altitude 0. The conventional explanation is that the pilot was monitoring their aircraft progress on the navigation display, and when Bithad replaced Agari as the next waypoint, the pilot turned off the transponder, but paused briefly at the altitude reporting off position, which sets the altitude to 0, before turning the knob to standby. At this point, it is time to help Brodsky get down the hatch to the MEC, the Main Equipment Center. Remember, Brodsky had only 39 minutes from the time of takeoff to the time that the flight reached Agari in order to steal a plane. I recently traveled on a wide-body jet in business class and watched how the cabin crew at the front of the plane interacted during the first 45 minutes after takeoff. The only time I could see when the forward galley area might be empty was a few minutes after takeoff, when the cabin crew seemed to disappear, although it was unclear if they were still in the galley area just behind a bulkhead or if they had actually moved to the rear. After that, they were up front preparing for drink and meal service and were constantly toing and froing in the vicinity of where the hatch would have been located. Drink service did not start until 30 minutes after takeoff, and the cart did not advance past where Brodsky would have been seated until 38 minutes past takeoff. Frankly, there would have been no realistic chance that Brodsky could have slipped down the hatch unnoticed had he been on my flight. Obviously, the layout of MH370 would be somewhat different, and there were fewer passengers in business class compared to my flight. The red square shows the actual location of the hatch. Had someone been seated in 1D, they would have had a clear view of the hatch. Even seat 2D, which was occupied, would have had a clear view if Brodsky were standing upright. A crouching person, however, might have been hidden. I see no advantage to Brodsky being in seat 3K. Jeff had previously posited that the 2 Ukrainians in back had created a disturbance that would have drawn the flight attendants to the rear. Let us suppose that that is what happened, and for whatever reason Brodsky was then able to slip down the hatch unnoticed. Oh yes, something else that Comrade Jeff has not told us is how much hardware did Brodsky bring with him through security and later down the hatch? Now the fun begins. Brodsky had a number of things to do. Let's go at them one at a time. The order here is not necessarily the order he would have worked. 1. Disable the Satcom. He needed to wait until the last ACARS message completed at 1708. For this, he would then pull 3 circuit breakers. 2. Disable the VHF and HF radios. He needed to wait until the last Goodnight Malaysia 370 message was sent at 17:19:30. The breakers for the radios themselves are up on the flight deck, but it may have been possible to disable them by pulling 3 breakers for the radio tuner panels. 3. Cyber hack into the magical ARINC 629 bus. Comrade Jeff has in mind that once in there, he plugs a custom box into the ARINC 629 bus and it's off to the races. Now comes our first difficulty. There is no such thing as the ARINC 629 bus. There are 11 such buses, 4 systems buses, 3 flight controls buses, and 4 Ames box intercabinet buses. Do you hack one of each type? And what does Comrade Jeff mean by cyber attack? Previously, he has described tapping into the ARINC 629 bus as being like having root access. Not so fast, Comrade Jeff. Yes, you have access to all the signals of the bus, but that is not the same thing as having root access. Likewise, if you have access to my home network, that does not mean you would have root access to the machines connected to that network. One really needs to understand the systems better before declaring victory. Now, for any signal being sent on the bus that you want to hack, you need to stop it from being sent and replace it with your own. If you don't care what the value of the signal was originally, you might detect when the signal starts, it's going to be several data packets, and then transmit on the bus at the same time, causing the signal to be garbled. Then, when given a chance, you send the same signal, but with your own values encoded. However, tapping into any of the ARINC 629 buses may not be the right thing after all. In some cases, what we want to do is to conduct what is called a man-in-the-middle type attack. You intercept broadcasts from a device, and based on their values, replace some or all of them with your own. To do this, you don't just plug into the bus. Rather, you disconnect the targeted device from the bus, basically pulling what's called a stub cable, plug that into your magic box, and then run your own stub cable to the bus in its stead. The current mode coupler, which is what actually attaches to the bus, remains in place. Of course, one still needs to deal with the fact that all systems on a 777 are present in duplicate or even triplicate, and you have to understand which one is active and tap into the appropriate bus. I hope Brodsky brought along lots of gear. Before going further in the MEC, let's first ask, supposing you're on the flight deck, you're currently in the cruise phase of the flight, how do you actually fly a 777? Now, I'm not a pilot of any kind, so what I will describe here is just my impression based on watching videos and reading articles and various aviation manuals. The two most important pieces of equipment are the CDU, Control Display Unit, and the Mode Control Panel, MCP. The CDU is the main interface to the flight management computer, which is where the flight plan is entered and executed. If you want to change your destination from, say, Beijing to Yubileni, this is the device you would use to do it. The MCP is part of the autopilot flight director system. The flight director basically tells you how to steer the plane according to a particular mode of operation, and the most common mode is called LNAV, where the FMC provides the desired information. There is an equivalent set of modes for the vertical direction involving thrust and pitch, and the most common of these is VNAV, vertical navigation, also provided by the FMC. Suppose you wanted to change altitude, say, to make a step climb. You need to dial the target altitude into the MCP first, even if the step climb is programmed into the FMC. You can punch a button on the MCP to carry out what is called altitude intervention. If you want to steer around, say, bad weather, you would enter a lateral route offset by using the CDU. Now you are down in the MEC and want to fly a 777 by tapping into the ARINC 629 buses. Comrade Jeff has stated that if you did so, you could do communications, flight controls, Satcom, whatever you need. Really? Here I show you the major high-level systems involved in flying a 777. You have the SMCS, the AFDS, and a third system, the Thrust Management Compute System. Yes, flight controls are present on the flight controls buses. The CDU can control the FMC. The ADARU, which sends out the initial reference system data, also broadcasts on the flight controls buses. But communications? Nope. Satcom? Nope. Landing gear? Nope. Thrust control? Nope. And the big killer here is that the MCP does not communicate on any of the ARINC 629 buses either. Even GPS information is absent from the buses. So no, Comrade Jeff, you cannot do whatever you need. So Comrade Jeff keeps uttering the word cyberhack to describe how Brodsky absconded with MH370. But cyberhack into what? The ARINC 629 buses by themselves, as we have seen, are not enough. The flight controls operate at too low a level to be of any use. This aircraft has magnificent flight management computers and autopilot flight director computers. We want to leverage them. Here's my best attempt. First, we mimic a CDU. On the right, Ken Monroe is holding a current mode coupler, which is what attaches to the ARINC 629 bus. Coming out of it is a stub cable. We want to unplug an existing CDU stub cable, reroute it to our magic box, and connect our own stub cable back into the current mode coupler on the systems bus. Yes, the first officer might complain about losing his CDU, but that's his problem. So now we can reprogram the FMC to take us to Yubileni, except we can't change altitude. Oh yes, the CDU is the normal mechanism by which the flight crew communicates with the Satcom. But that requires an ARINC 429 connection, which we don't have. Dang. Is it possible to hack into the autopilot flight director system? But there are 3 of them, and each has 3 processors inside. Loading new software requires taking down the systems bus, which I don't think is a good thing, and it would take a lot of time. Some of these software packages take over 30 minutes to upload. However, I found something interesting. Only one AFDS is active at any time. The other 2 are operating but in standby mode. It turns out that the active AFDS is the source of MCP data for the 2 others, so we only need to hack into one. Beyond this point, however, we can only speculate. Is there a way to exploit an AFDS, perhaps by injecting packets onto either a system bus or a flight controls bus that the active AFDS will ingest and either cause a buffer overflow type exploit or activate a hack backdoor mechanism that allows us to overwrite certain instructions? It all seems improbable, but that's the best I could come up with. So you've done all the hard work to take control of the plane from the flight deck. You can sit back and relax, right? No. All that the pilot has to do is to push this one switch and all your hard work will be undone. The primary flight control disconnect switch places the plane in what's called direct mode. What this means is that all the computer systems in the main equipment center are bypassed completely. For good measure, you can disengage and disarm the auto throttle as well. Although a 777 is a fly-by-wire aircraft, all the cables of old are replaced by wires that carry analog voltages. It is these voltages that fundamentally control the aircraft. In direct mode, voltages from transducers on the control columns and rudders feed directly into the actuator control electronics, the ACE cards, which then drive the various power control units that actually move the flight control surfaces. In normal mode, the computer systems are used to determine how to move the control surfaces, but the outputs are fed to digital to analog converters for use by the ACE card. It would seem that disabling the transponder ought to be straightforward, but it turns out to be anything but. First, how does Brodsky even know that Agari is the transfer of control point? Different departure paths from Kuala Lumpur International Airport could use different waypoints, and in fact these days flights to Beijing use a totally different waypoint well to the east. Agari was the worst of all possibilities because it had the shortest elapsed time to be reached after takeoff. Even if he were given the filed flight plan somehow in advance, it could have changed at the last minute. So he needs to tap into the flight controls bus immediately to assess his situation. Next, there are 2 transponders. Which one was in use? Standard practice of Malaysia Airlines was to use the left one, but did Brodsky want to roll the dice? The selection of which one was used was not done automatically, but was controlled by a switch on the flight deck. The circuit breakers were on the flight deck. There was no direct connection to the ARINC 629 buses, although altitude information was passed from the flight controls bus to the Ames cabinet and thence to the transponders. So you could pull the transponders out of their sockets in the equipment rack, but a better way would be to disconnect the antennas, one top and one bottom, since you would have better control over the timing. Okay, one is behind the transponder on the E1 rack, so you'd have to pull off the back panel of the rack and access it from the rear. However, the last 2 broadcasts at altitude 0. How to make that happen? Inject fake altitude 0 packets on the flight control 629 buses? But other aircraft systems such as the flight management computer, AFDS, and primary flight controls rely on those data as well. Further, why? In the transponders, altitude 0 is controlled by a discrete signal from the flight deck. Even if I could come up with the scheme, getting the timing right would be a nightmare. I am stumped. What is the best way to hack the Satcom? At first I thought there might be a possibility of doing it with the CDU since it has an interface to the Satcom. Perhaps there would be a backdoor, some undocumented page that would allow entering information to overwrite the system table. However, that interface is via an ARINC 429 line, which we don't have. One might think of loading new firmware, but that takes time, requiring hacking the weight on wheels interlock, and would require the Satcom to remain powered on, which we know it wasn't. Additionally, if it was going through a portable maintenance access terminal, it would require weight on wheels to be on the ground for 5 minutes and airspeed to be less than 40 knots. It may also require the CDU to place it in a correct configuration, which was not available from the main equipment center. Hacking the IR's data requires a man-in-the-middle type arrangement. Doing so with the ADARUs seems unwise since they are needed to fly the aircraft. The best I can see is hacking the ARINC 429 inertial reference system bus out of the Ames box on the left Ames cabinet, shunting the cable through the magic box, then unplugging the IRS bus on the right Ames cabinet. Note that the data are also used by the ground proximity warning system and by the GPS radios, so caveat emptor. Of course, these troublesome 1828 BFOs are still present, so maybe Brodsky waited until the logon was complete, then activated the hack. But what if he did it in the middle of an attempted phone call by Malaysia Airlines, as happened at 1839? He has no way of knowing what communications might be in progress at any time. Finally, there are additional complications. The hacks above all envisage replacing the flight plan in the flight management computer with one that goes north. However, while the military and civilian primary radar tracks were not all that accurate, a few features would be difficult to understand. First, according to the Safety Information Report, the Turnback was so sharp that Boeing was unable to recreate it using the autopilot alone. It would appear to have been hand-flown. Creating such a maneuver would likely require conducting a man-in-the-middle attack on the flight management computer, injecting instructions that would produce a more highly banked turn. Such an attack, however, would be unable to increase thrust, which would be needed to match the observed speed of MH370 when it overflew peninsular Malaysia. 2. The route across peninsular Malaysia could have made use of airways M765 and B219, but did not. The bearing changed multiple times, which, while it could have been achieved with the piecemeal lateral navigation segments, would be quite odd. 3. The turn around Penang Island is not a standard flight management computer type maneuver, and would require a complex flight plan to implement. In short, the Turnback had the hallmarks of a route flown by hand. Then I have a number of questions for Comrade Jeff. 1. Did Brodsky get any sleep before this flight? Were you able to track his itinerary before and after he departed Bali? 2. There's a small detail of what happened to the passengers, the flight crew, and the 2 Ukrainians. Was the plane depressurized? If so, how is it done, and how long would it take? We know that Zahari Shah was talking normally on the radio at 17:19:30, and the diversion began 3.5 minutes later. Is that enough time? How did Chustrak and Dyneka survive? 3. You cannot auto-land a plane from the main equipment center. At some point, the Russians would need to break into the flight deck. Would they still be awake 7 hours after takeoff? 4. Finally, why did they fly back across Malaysia if the intent was to reach Ubulani? If the plane had gone directly from Magari, it might have had enough fuel. The diversion killed that opportunity. Is Comrade Jeff's story of a route north a conspiracy theory? I consulted Wikipedia as to what constitutes a conspiracy theory and found the following. Wiki. A conspiracy theory is an explanation for an event or situation that asserts the existence of a conspiracy by powerful and sinister groups, often political in motivation. Comrade Jeff, my suspicion fell on Russia, with technically advanced satellites, avionics, and aircraft manufacturing industries. Wiki. Conspiracy theories are not able to be falsified. Comrade Jeff, the spoof scenario posits an attacker of extraordinary skill and sophistication. Wiki. Each time new evidence becomes available, a conspiracy theory is able to dismiss it by claiming that even more people must be part of the cover-up. Comrade Jeff, who is Blaine Gibson? Wiki. Any information that contradicts the conspiracy theory is suggested to be disinformation by the alleged conspiracy itself. Comrade Jeff, they turned on the Satcom in order to provide a false trail of breadcrumbs leading away from the plane's true route. Wiki. Nearly all observations are explained as having been deliberately planned by the alleged conspirators. Comrade Jeff, 3 minutes after disappearing from primary radar, the plane began sending out a signal with unique and wonderful properties. So what do you think? Does it qualify?